Jim Beam just shut down bourbon production at its main Kentucky distillery, and Canada did that. I need you to understand what just happened here. One of America's most iconic brands, a distillery that's been making bourbon since before the Civil War, is going dark on January 1st because Canadians decided they were done drinking American whiskey. But here's where it gets complicated. This isn't just about bourbon. This is about what happens when a country that was supposed to be your closest ally, your best friend, your biggest trading partner, decides they've had enough. And I've spent the last week going through the data, the reports, the economic projections, and what I'm seeing is unlike anything in modern North American history. Let me take you back to where this all started. January 2025, Donald Trump walks back into the Oval Office and immediately does something no American president has ever done to Canada. He threatens to annex them, not as a joke, not as negotiating theater. He looked into the camera and said Canada should become the 51st state. He called their prime minister a governor. He slapped 25% tariffs on everything they export to us, citing fentanyl, of all things, as his justification. And here's the part that kept me up last night. The conventional wisdom in Washington was that Canada would fold. Every trade expert, every policy analyst, everyone who covers this stuff was saying the same thing. Canada is too dependent on the American market. They send 75% of their exports to us. They can't survive a trade war. They'll make some noise, maybe impose symbolic tariffs, but ultimately they'll come to the table and accept whatever terms Trump offers. That assessment was catastrophically wrong. Within weeks of Trump's tariff announcement, Canadian provinces started pulling American alcohol off their shelves, not symbolically, physically removing every bottle of Jack Daniels, every bottle of Jim Beam, every California wine from every government-run liquor store. We're talking about millions of dollars worth of product just gone, vanished from Canadian retail overnight. Wait, it gets worse. The boycott didn't stop at the liquor store. Canadians started canceling their American vacations en masse. They stopped crossing the border to shop. They started downloading apps to help them identify and avoid American products at the grocery store. They joined Facebook groups, 1.4 million members strong, yet dedicated to buying Canadian, and the numbers are devastating. Reports now confirm that exports of American spirits to Canada crashed 85% in the second quarter of 2025, not 8.5%, 85%. The Distillery Trade Group is calling it unprecedented. Jack Daniel's parent company just reported their Canadian sales dropped 62% in a single quarter. But that's not even the real story. The tourism numbers are where this becomes a genuine economic crisis for border states. A congressional report just came out, and I want you to hear this, showing that passenger vehicle crossings from Canada dropped nearly 20% in 2025. In some border states, it hit 27%. The U.S. Travel Association is forecasting a $5.7 billion loss in international tourism spending this year, and they're attributing most of that loss directly to Canadians staying home. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. This wasn't some grassroots movement that happened by accident. This was strategic. The Canadian government targeted specific American products from specific American states, and those states happened to be Trump country. Florida orange juice, tariffed. By June, shipments had dropped to their lowest level in over 20 years. Kentucky bourbon, banned from shelves in most provinces. That's Mitch McConnell's home state getting hit where it hurts. Here's what nobody's talking about. The Canadians developed a phrase for this resistance, elbows up. It's a hockey term. It's what Gordie Howe used to do to opponents who got too aggressive. And it became this national rallying cry. You started seeing it on T-shirts, on social media, in protest signs. It represented this idea that Canada wasn't going to take the abuse lying down. And then came the election that changed everything. Mark Carney, a former central banker who had never held political office, somehow managed to lead the Liberal Party to their fourth consecutive term in April 2025. And I say somehow because just months earlier, the Liberals were polling 25 points behind the Conservatives. Justin Trudeau had been forced to resign. The party was in freefall, but Trump's threats unified the country in a way nobody anticipated. Carney ran on a simple message. Canada will never be the 51st state. And Canadians responded. They turned out in record numbers for early voting. They elected Carney's party, and in what has to be one of the most stunning political collapses I've ever seen, they voted Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre out of his own seat, a seat he'd held for 20 years. This is the part that should concern everyone in Washington. When Carney gave his victory speech, he didn't extend an olive branch to Trump. He declared that Canada's old relationship with the United States a relationship based on steadily increased integration, is over. He said when he sits down with Trump, it will be as the leader of a sovereign nation with many, many other options than the U.S. Those aren't diplomatic talking points. That's a fundamental realignment of North American geopolitics. So let me walk you through what's actually happening to the American economy because of this standoff. And I want to be clear, these aren't projections or estimates. These are real numbers, real businesses, real jobs being affected right now. But first, here's where it gets really interesting. The Trump administration raised tariffs on Canadian goods to 35% in August, 35%. And their justification? Fentanyl. They're claiming Canada isn't doing enough to stop drugs from crossing the northern border, which, by the way, represents a tiny fraction of the fentanyl coming into this country compared to the southern border. But Canada didn't blink. Prime Minister Carney called it disappointing, but immediately pivoted to his government's long-term strategy, diversification. He announced a plan to double Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Many of Canada's former strengths based on close ties to America have become vulnerabilities." And then this happened. In late August, Carney dropped most of Canada's retaliatory tariffs to match exemptions under the existing trade deal. The media called it a capitulation. Critics said he was appeasing Trump, but here's what they missed. Carney kept tariffs on the sectors that hurt the most: steel, aluminum, and autos. He essentially said, we'll play nice on the small stuff, but we're not backing down where it counts. Now, I want to show you something that explains why this matters. Canada isn't just any trading partner. They're our largest source of imported oil. 60% of U.S. crude imports come from Canada. They supply 85% of our imported electricity. They're our top foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium. They have 34 critical minerals that the Pentagon considers essential for national security. So when Trump says America has all the leverage, he's not telling you the whole story. Here's what's happening on the ground. In Plattsburgh, New York, 35 minutes from Montreal, a golf resort that used to see 70% of its customers come from Canada is now barely seeing any Canadian visitors at all. The owner told reporters, "It's been a dramatic drop. It's very rare that we see someone pull in from Canada." In the Buffalo Niagara Falls area, retailers reported an 83% decrease in Canadian shoppers. 83%. In Montana, near the Alberta border, a hotel saw a 40% year-over-year drop in Canadian customers. They've started offering discounts specifically to Canadians, a Canadian Welcome Pass, just to try to get some of them back. But here's the thing that really worries me. Business owners are saying this damage might be permanent. One Vermont innkeeper put it perfectly. This is long-lasting damage to a relationship, and emotional damage takes time to heal. While people aren't visiting Vermont, they'll be finding new places to visit, making new memories, building new family traditions, and we will not recapture all of that. The bourbon industry is in crisis mode. Jim Beam is halting production at its main Claremont, Kentucky distillery for all of 2026. They say they're doing site enhancements, but let's be real. They have 16.1 million barrels of bourbon aging in Kentucky warehouses right now, a record high, because demand has collapsed. And it's not just Jim Beam. The entire American spirits industry is reeling. Exports fell 9% across the board in the second quarter of 2025. Brandy exports to Canada dropped 67%. Gin fell 76%. Vodka and cordials each dropped 71%. These aren't small numbers. Canada was the second largest market for American spirits. Now, here's what nobody is asking. What happens when the CUSMA trade agreement comes up for review in July 2026? Because that's coming fast. And Trump has already called the deal transitional, suggesting he might want to blow it up entirely. The stakes couldn't be higher. This trade agreement covers $3.6 billion in daily cross-border commerce. It supports millions of jobs. And right now, talks are stalled because Trump got offended by an anti-tariff advertisement that Ontario ran in the United States. I'm not making this up. Trade negotiations between two of the world's largest economies collapsed because of a TV commercial. And here's what should terrify American businesses. Like, Carney is actively courting China and India. He's strengthening ties with Europe. He's talking about building an energy corridor that would let Canada export to Asia instead of being dependent on American markets. The old assumption that Canada had nowhere else to go, that's changing faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. I want to show you something that happened just last week because it perfectly captures where we are right now. Ukrainian President Zelensky was on his way to meet Trump in Florida for peace talks. But before he got there, he stopped in Canada. And what happened in that meeting tells you everything you need to know about the difference between Canadian and American leadership on the world stage. Prime Minister Carney met Zelensky at a Halifax airport. They embraced. Carney announced $2.5 billion in new economic assistance for Ukraine, money that will help unlock additional financing from the IMF and World Bank. And then Carney said something remarkable. The barbarism that we saw overnight, the attack on Kyiv, shows just how important it is that we stand with Ukraine during this difficult time. He was referring to a massive Russian assault that had just happened, over 500 drones and dozens of missiles targeting the Ukrainian capital, killing civilians, knocking out power to hundreds of thousands of people. Now contrast that with what happened when Zelensky arrived in Florida. Reports indicate Trump didn't send anyone to greet him at the airport. The meeting itself was reportedly chaotic, with Trump going on tangents about how Putin wants to help Ukraine and how he trusts Putin's characterization of the conflict. But that's not even the most disturbing part. While Carney was announcing billions in aid and coordinating with European allies, he had a virtual meeting with leaders from Germany, France, Italy, Sweden, and NATO right there in Halifax. Trump was telling reporters that Zelensky doesn't have anything until I approve it. Here's what I can't stop thinking about. Canada is showing up for democracy. They're supporting Ukraine. They're building coalitions with European allies. They're demonstrating what Western leadership is supposed to look like. And what is the Trump administration doing? Alienating allies, threatening neighbors, and cozying up to authoritarians. Zelensky himself called Putin a man of war at that Halifax press conference. He said Russia's massive attack on Kyiv, the year's longest sustained assault on the capital, proves Putin doesn't want peace. And standing next to him was Mark Carney, the leader of a country that Trump has been trying to bully into submission for an entire year. The optics couldn't be more striking. Now, let me tell you about a threat that's emerging inside Canada itself. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has been flirting with separatism. And I don't use that word lightly. Her government passed legislation making it easier to hold a referendum on Alberta independence. The threshold for gathering signatures dropped from 600,000 to just 177,000. Smith says she personally doesn't support separation, but she's been meeting with Trump allies, appearing on Fox News and making statements that sound a lot like someone who's keeping her options open. Here's what worries me about this. One Fox Business anchor suggested that Trump could chip off a piece of Canada by doing deals with the oil-rich section, meaning Alberta. And that's exactly the kind of divide and conquer strategy that autocrats use to weaken democracies. The separatist movement in Alberta is being actively encouraged by some American media voices. They're holding rallies, they're gathering signatures, they're looking at the Trump administration as a potential partner rather than a threat. But here's what the separatists aren't telling Albertans. Indigenous chiefs have come out strongly against this movement. They've pointed out that Alberta sits on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 lands, treaties with the Crown that the province has no authority to nullify. As one chief put it, anyone who wants to separate can gladly go live in any other country, but they will not be taking any treaty or inherent lands with them. The whole thing is a constitutional nightmare waiting to happen. And yet Trump's rhetoric keeps feeding it. Every time he threatens annexation, every time he calls Canada the 51st state, he gives ammunition to people who want to tear the country apart from within. This is the part that should concern every American. A destabilized Canada is not in our national interest. We share the longest undefended border in the world. We have integrated economies, integrated defense systems, integrated energy grids. If Canada fragments or falls into political chaos, we feel that directly. But the Trump administration seems either oblivious to this or actively trying to cause it. So where does this leave us as we head into 2026? I've been trying to make sense of what's happened over the past year, and I keep coming back to a single conclusion. Donald Trump woke up Canada. Before January 2025, Canadians were sleepwalking toward disaster. And that's how one analyst described it. They were divided, uncertain, frustrated with their own government. The Conservative Party was polling 25 points ahead. Everyone assumed Pierre Poilievre would be the next prime minister. And then Trump attacked, and everything changed. Here's what I think is really happening. Canada is demonstrating something that a lot of Americans have forgotten. You don't have to accept abuse from bullies. You don't have to fold just because someone threatens you. You don't have to abandon your values because the most powerful person in the room tells you to. The Canadian boycott didn't stop the tariffs, Mark Carney hasn't gotten Trump to back down. The economic pain is real on both sides of the border. But Canada has shown something more important than winning a trade war. They've shown they can take a punch and stay standing, and now they're building something new. Carney is talking about reducing internal trade barriers between Canadian provinces. He's pushing for energy independence. He's diversifying export markets. He's strengthening relationships with Europe and Asia. He's treating this crisis as an opportunity to build a stronger, more self-reliant country. Now, what does this mean for 2026? The big showdown is coming in July when the CUSMA trade agreement hits its mandatory review. Trump has called the deal transitional. He suggested the U.S. might withdraw entirely. His administration wants major concessions, stricter rules of origin, changes to auto manufacturing requirements, new restrictions on Canadian dairy. But Canada isn't approaching these negotiations from a position of weakness anymore. They've proven they can hurt American industries. Ask the bourbon makers in Kentucky. They've proven they can mobilize politically. Ask Pierre Poilievre, who lost his own seat. They've proven they can survive international pressure. Ask the European leaders who keep inviting Carney to the table. Here's what nobody in Washington wants to admit. Canada has leverage, real leverage. The critical minerals America needs for batteries and electronics, Canada has them. The oil that keeps American refineries running, Canada supplies it. The electricity that powers border states, much of it comes from Canadian hydroelectric plants. Trump keeps saying he has all the cards, but Canada is sitting on a pretty strong hand too. And here's what really concerns me about the year ahead. The Alberta separatist movement isn't going away. Danielle Smith has committed to holding a referendum in 2026 if petitioners gather enough signatures. The signatures are being gathered right now. A third of Albertans tell pollsters they'd consider voting to leave Canada. Could a separatist movement actually succeed? Probably not, at least not right away. But the Brexit precedent is haunting. British Prime Minister David Cameron called a referendum he was sure he'd win. He lost. He resigned in disgrace. Britain is still paying the price, counted in hundreds of billions of dollars. If Trump keeps pushing, keeps threatening, keeps trying to destabilize Canadian politics, who knows what becomes possible? The bigger picture here is this. We are witnessing the end of a 70-year relationship. The continental partnership that emerged after World War II, the integrated economy, the shared defense, the cultural kinship that's being dismantled in real time. Carney said it himself. Our old relationship with the United States is over. I don't think most Americans understand what we're losing. We've taken Canadian friendship for granted for so long that we forgot it was something that needed to be maintained. We forgot that respect has to be mutual. We forgot that the strongest alliances are built on trust, not threats. And now Canadians are looking for other options. They're building bridges to Europe and Asia. They're reducing their dependence on American markets. They're preparing for a future where they can't count on their southern neighbor. That's the real cost of Trump's Canada policy, not just the lost tourism dollars or the closed distilleries or the failing trade talks. It's the loss of something that took generations to build and might take generations to repair. I'm curious what you think about this. Does anyone in Washington understand what they're throwing away, or is it already too late to fix this?